Hey everyone. Before we dive into the lecture for this week, I just wanted to talk about a couple of quick things here at the top. Uh, One is that the lecture that you're about to see actually is my lecture from last semester, the fall of 2021, the lecture that I did for week one of that semester. I'm using that video for a couple of reasons. One, these past couple of weeks, right before the beginning of classes, have been particularly busy for me, and the time to record just wasn't there. Um, Secondly, on top of that, and I guess perhaps even as part of that, um, I'm touching this particular spot on my side. I had a liver biopsy on uh, on Friday of this week, and as a result, I've sort of been incapacitated. And I'm no problem recording a little short something like this, but trying to record an entire lecture while feeling the way I feel right now just wasn't in the cards. So I mean, everything that I talk about in this lecture is what I would have said this semester anyway. There might be a reference now and then that pertains to something that was going on in fall of 2020, but everything in general is what I would want you to know. However, you can, of course, ignore anything on there that says fall 2020. We're in fall of 2021. Another thing I want to let you know is I'm going to, in a couple of spots early on in the lecture, I am going to come in and interrupt my past self to talk about a couple of interesting things that have been discovered more recently, because I think they're important to add to the conversation that I'm having in the lecture from a year ago. Okay, so yeah, so be on the lookout for those. All right, that's all I have to say. So we'll dive right in.
Hey everyone, it is week one of this semester, the fall 2020 semester, that is, of Western Literature and the Arts 1, which, by the way, a lot of students will just call humanities. We'll call it Humanities 1 and 2. You're perfectly welcome to refer to it as that. And hopefully by now you have gotten the textbook. And if you have this, as it mentions here, I want you to read for this lecture chapter 1, Origins, pages 2 through 27. I'm going to split this lecture up into two parts, both of which should be posted on Google Classroom. But you'll notice that there's only one PDF of the slideshow that is posted with the lectures. I'm going to do that every lecture. I'm going to post a PDF version of the slides that you see in the lecture. But this is all one lecture. I'm just splitting it up into two videos to make it a little bit more bite size, if you will. Okay, so chapter 1, Origins. As that chapter title would suggest, Origins. We're talking about the origins of human culture, and in our case, we're going to eventually veer off into specifically Western culture. Western culture could really be defined as European culture and those cultures that can trace their roots back to Europe. But when it comes to the origins of human culture, we all, no matter what, Western, Eastern, what have you, we all have the same origins. We all share those same origins. Your book does not have this particular piece in it, but I always like to bring this up in the first lecture of this class. This is a piece of engraved ochre. Ochre is a type of mineral. This particular piece of ochre was found in the Blombos cave in South Africa and dates back to about 75,000 BCE. Which, by the way, let me explain. When it comes to dates, we're going to spend a good portion of this class in the period that is that we've called in the past before Christ, BC. But in more recent years, it has come to be called BCE, before Common Era. All right. So anyway, let's just look at this. So we have a calendar where years are dated around the estimated birth year of Christ. And as such, that the year that is estimated when Christ would have been born is considered AD, or now the Common Era. So AD, Anno Domini, or CE, Common Era, right? That's the time period in which we currently live, right? It starts with year one, it goes all the way up to, at this point, 2020 years of the Common Era, as it's referred to now. And so as a result, those numbers count upward from 1 to, like I said, 2020 at this point. But BC or BCE, before Common Era, those are years before that estimated birth of Christ. And as such, the further back in time you go, the higher that number is. So that, as you can see here on this scale, 2000 BCE was longer ago than 500 BCE, right? So when we talk about 75,000 BCE, and that C with the period means circa, means it was somewhere around that time. We have no way to get an exact date, right? The carbon dating gets us somewhere around 75,000 BCE. We're talking about 75,000 plus 2020, right? So a 77,000-year-old piece of ochre that some human being on the continent of Africa scratched into the surface, engraved into the surface, these marks that you see here. There are some horizontal striations that are cut into it, along with some diagonal striations that are cut into it that create sort of these diamond shapes, right? And this, right now, is recognized as the earliest piece of artwork that has been found so far. 76,000 years, or I'm sorry, 77,000 years ago. That means art has been around for a good long while. We as human beings have been making art for at least that long, 77,000 years. And understand that this particular piece of ochre has really only been found in like the last 15, 20 years. I forget exactly how long. When I was a student in undergrad, like yourself, art was only dated back to about 35,000 years ago. So this more than doubled that, right? Once this was discovered.
This is one of the times I said I was going to interrupt myself, because as it turns out, this may not be the oldest piece of artwork that has been found. We've actually discovered this particularly interesting piece, known as the Venus of Tintin. Now, this piece right here is clearly a carving meant to look like a human being, but this piece was created anywhere between 200,000 and 500,000 years ago. Now, pardon my French, but like, holy shit. I mean, that's that goes way back. We're talking about a time at which this piece very well could have been made by hominids even earlier, before the time of Homo sapiens. We could be talking about Homo erectus, or maybe even an earlier hominid. That puts a new, particularly interesting twist on the origins of art. And it's not the only contender. There's an even older piece that's a bit controversial. There is this piece here known as the Venus of Barakat Ran. I hope I'm pronouncing that right. I searched online and found about 3 different ways that people were pronouncing it. This particular piece could be anywhere from 230,000 to 700,000 years old. But I said it's controversial because historians and archaeologists are arguing as to whether or not this is actually a piece of art. Certainly to our eyes, this looks vaguely human, shaped. But is it, or is it just a rock that got weathered by erosion over hundreds of thousands of years? So although we can't necessarily say that this piece is the earliest known artwork that's been found, we at least can certainly point to the Venus of Tantan and say that it pushes the origins of art back hundreds of thousands of years from where we thought it was. Now, that's not going to change anything that I'm about to say. Well, I mean, it changes the fact that I'm going to point out often that this is the earliest known piece of artwork that we know of. But it's not going to change the discussion around why this piece of artwork might have been made. But I do want you to understand that in the time since I made this video, I have read things where there are some other contenders that push the origins of art even further back than what we originally thought.
The reason I like to bring this up is that I wish we were in the classroom, right? Because if we were in the classroom, I would ask you, the students, what it is about this that makes people consider it art. Like, why is this necessarily considered art? Right? This piece of ochre and all the scratches that have been made into it. What's considered art because it seems to have a design to it. It seems to have a very intentional design. There are repeated patterns, right? Someone did this to this piece of rock, to this piece of mineral, this ochre, not for a utilitarian purpose. At least it doesn't seem to be, right? This piece of ochre most likely would have been used for, ochre at the time was often used for sort of face painting and things, but we don't exactly know what it would have been used for, right? It could have been a cake of ochre that one would have wet their hands and gotten that yellowy color of the ochre to then use for face paint. But we have no way of knowing. We can't go back 77,000 years ago and know why this was used. But those marks on it don't seem to serve a purpose. They don't seem to help the utility of the object, right? It's not as if there's a handle built onto the ochre, right, that would help with holding it or what have you, right? This seems to be decoration. And so the next question I often ask is, why do you think whoever did this did it? So some of the things that students will often bring up about why whoever carved these markings into this piece of ochre, why they might have done it. Well, one of the suggestions that's often brought up is maybe they just wanted it to look nice, right? And that makes 100% perfect sense. If I am a human in 75,000 BCE and I have this piece of ochre, and maybe I'm just sick of the stuff around me all looking the same, and I want this one to look pretty. I want it to be decorative and look nice. And when I look at it, I see that it's something different from the rest of my everyday existence, right? So I'm going to put some markings on it and make it look good, all right? And that is a reason for making art. Another that people will often bring up is that maybe there was some sort of religious or spiritual or whatever it may have been, some significance of that nature, spiritual, religious, what have you, and that this represents something cultural for that individual. And sure, that could be, right? Perhaps by inscribing this piece of ochre, we've inscribed into it some sort of spiritual power, spiritual ability, whatever that may be, right? And that's a reason to make art. One thing that's often mentioned, and I always love this one, is that some people will say maybe it was just to make sure that everybody knew that this belonged to the person who made it, right? Like, maybe this is a logo, right? Granted, that's an extremely modern term to use, but maybe that's exactly what this is, right? Like, if I am one who provides ochre for the people who live in my region, I want them to know that they're getting it from the right source. So I scribe this onto it so that people know this came from me. Or if it's not a logo, perhaps it's just some way to make sure that I know it's mine. Maybe I, in 75,000 BCE, am just sick of someone always taking my ochre, right? So I put these little markings on it. Because if it comes up missing again and I see someone has it, I'll know that it's mine. And I could be like, hey, dude, that's my piece of ochre. Why do you have it? And the person would say, I don't know what you're talking about. This is mine. I've had it the whole time. And I could say, oh, yeah? Well, then why does it have my name on it, Eric? So perhaps that's what it is. It's a way, perhaps it's just a means of making sure that others know to whom it belongs or from whom it came. And those are all reasons to make art. And so as such, we see that art is very intrinsically tied into what it is to be human. And what I love about when we sort of talk these things out and speculate over all the reasons why the person who made these markings on this piece of ochre might have done it, that we participate in this moment where we are having a very first-hand conversation with whoever this was. This man, woman, child, whomever, who made this 77,000 years ago. If nothing else, they were making something that needed to communicate some sort of an idea to someone else. And they've done that with us 77,000 years later. And in that moment, that time, all those tens of thousands of years are just compressed. And we can have a little moment that we can have an actual conversation with a human being who lived so long ago that it could feel like we have nothing in common with them, and we learn, but we're not so different from whoever this was who made this piece of ochre look pretty one day. Or we know that art is at least 77,000 years old. Humans have been making it for at least that long. Now, as I say, we're talking about the origins of human culture, not just Western culture in this particular case. And so historians have broken the time of human beings up into certain periods. One period is known as the Stone Age. And the Stone Age gets split into further divisions. The first one of which is called the Paleolithic period. It is so called because Paleolithic means Old Stone Age. There's, well, I thought I had another note for this, but paleo is Latin for old. Lith is Latin for stone, so Old Stone Age. It would have taken place somewhere between 2 million. It would have begun somewhere around 2 million BCE, and continued on until around 10,000 BCE. I think your book marks that as around 9,000 BCE. This is all very muddy because no one area of the world came into the Paleolithic at exactly the same time, and no part of the world sort of advanced into the next period at the same time. So this is all muddy. This was a time period of about 95% of human existence was the Paleolithic period, where early hominids, such as Homo sapiens and the Neanderthals, as well as others, there was a time that we were not the only hominids on the planet. We are Homo sapiens. They, in the Paleolithic period, begin making crude stone cutting tools. They made tools such as fishing hooks, bows and arrows, and needles, again, all out of stone, which allowed them to have greater control over their surroundings. And this meant that they had the ability to conceive mental images and the hands for making those images concrete. This results in some of the first instances of artistic creativity, as we just mentioned with that piece of ochre, and as we'll see in a moment with some other examples. So again, Paleolithic period. Humans start making stone tools and start utilizing them to make life easier. These are different stone artifacts that come from from Southeast China. Things for hunting and gathering, for survival. Then, when I was a student in undergrad, this is what was thought to be the earliest example of art, specifically the wall paintings, in this case in the Chauvet cave in France, that were painted somewhere between 32,000 and 30,000 BCE. These are Ice Age paintings on the walls of caves. They show reindeer, bison, rhinoceroses. It's amazing to think that there were rhinoceroses and even lions, as you can see up here, if my laser pointer will work. Lions on the European continent, but they were there. Now we see horses and things of that nature as well. My computer just flaked out on me, so I'll try to edit that little bit that just happened out. Anyway, so what I was trying to say, no longer is this believed to be the earliest form of human artwork, but it is at least considered the earliest naturalistic art. That's important. I'd write it down if I were you. The purposes of these paintings is still a mystery, right? We don't know exactly why they were painted, but most likely, not most likely, but possibly they were related to hunting rituals. Perhaps either one goes into the cave and paints an image of the animal that they would like to capture that day, or could it be a celebration of the animal that was hunted and brought down? Hard to say. We can't know for sure.
Now, here I want to interrupt myself one more time, because there was in July of this year an interesting article on Atlas Obscura about some new discoveries in a cave in Spain. This was let me check, get my dates correct here. It was the cave was originally discovered in 2015, and the cave paintings within it were discovered so deep. They were 600 or more feet within the cave, that archaeologists found that particularly interesting, because to get that deep you had to bring the fire with you in order to see. And also on top of that, they were also found up very high. So that intrigues archaeologists. Like, how did these early people get up high enough to make these paintings? What were they using in order to do that? And it being that deep makes them think a little bit more about and ask certain questions, um, to sort of maybe narrow in or pinpoint some of the reasons why these paintings were done. And they have a couple of theories that they're sort of banging around, based on this new discovery. One is that because if you went down that deep, that far, you again would have had to have brought fire with you, and in order to paint what the intricate things that are being painted on these walls, that fire was going to have to be maintained and would have had to burn for a long time. And when you're that deep in a cave with a fire burning up all of your oxygen, you're going to get a little lightheaded because you don't have as much oxygen to breathe. And so there's a theory that maybe these were painted in this place because one being down there with a fire burning, getting sort of lightheaded and dizzy and maybe hallucinating, it could have felt like a very spiritual place for these people. But also the Atlas Obscura article, um, says that archaeologists are beginning to think that maybe because they see several um, overlapping images of the same animal in sort of different poses, that maybe as the fire was sort of flickering its light across these images, that maybe that was meant, that had been designed to make these animals look like they were moving, because the light would catch one frame, if you will, of movement and then flicker back, and perhaps the legs would be in a different position depending on how the fire was catching it. And combine that with the fact that you're getting a bit lightheaded and dizzy from the lack of oxygen, and this could have been kind of like, as it says in the title of the article, a proto cinema, meaning this could have been a place to just sort of go and enjoy watching these moving images, and how that might have seemed somewhat supernatural as well. It's an interesting article that just came out, and so I wanted to at least touch on it here.
But again, they are the first, the earliest known naturalistic art. Now, what do I mean by naturalistic? What we looked at with that piece of ochre. In fact, let me go back to it. All right, that piece of ochre, right? Lines, lines, angles, geometric shapes. That's abstract. Why is it abstract? Because there's not something that this refers to that exists out in the world, right? We don't look at those marks and say, oh yeah, there's a house, there's a tree, there's a horse, there's a rhinoceros, right? But we look at these and we see naturalism. We see people who are making these, and we see those humans very concerned with naturalism. They want to recreate what their eyes have seen, right? I mean, this is meant to represent something that has been seen. That is naturalism. And this is the earliest form that we know of naturalistic art. This piece, which is referred to as the Venus of Willendorf, was found in Austria, and it's from circa 25,000 BCE. It is one of many limestone figures that have been found. This one is only a little over 4 inches tall. Your book shows a completely different Venus figure. Many of these have been found over the years and have been referred to as Venus figures, because for a long time, when these were first being discovered back in the 19th century, in the 1800s, it was thought that these were meant to represent the Paleolithic ideal of feminine beauty in the same way that Venus, the goddess Venus, was meant to showcase feminine or be the ideal of feminine beauty for the ancient Greeks. We think, however, now, as more time has been spent studying these figures, that rather than physicality, or at least sexuality, right? The idealized, beautiful form of what a woman should look like. Rather than that, these little figures were most likely connected to a kind of mother goddess or fertility symbol, right? There seems to be an emphasis on the things that indicate a woman's fertility in this piece here. The mother goddess, or what sort of is referred to now as the mother goddess, we don't know what this would have been called in its time, appears in many cultures. And it's because so many cultures, and this is another thing that is important that I would suggest that you might take a note of, connect femininity with nature. Nature is often connected with femininity, because the fertility of a woman is often compared to the fertility of the earth. This one in particular is notable because of how it balances symbolism and realism. The one in your book, which, let me look, I want to make sure I give you the right page number, on page 7, is a very abstract image, the figurine on page 7. This one is still somewhat abstract, right? The Venus of Willendorf, as it is referred to because it was found in Willendorf, doesn't have a face. Instead, it has sort of this abstract representation of the braids that might have been in a woman's hair. But the rest of the body has this, again, there's the symbolism, right, of maternal fertility, of motherliness, of you know, and all those connections with femininity and nature. But also, the person who carved this, in many places, seems to have taken great care to create something that looks very realistic, right? This is made out of limestone, right? A fairly soft stone for carving, but still stone nonetheless. And yet you look at how the person who carved it has made the figure appear to be very soft flesh, as if you could reach out and pinch that skin. Then we move into what is known as the Neolithic era, or sometimes it is referred to as the Neolithic Revolution. So called because neo in Latin means new, and again, lith, stone. It's the new Stone Age. What marks the transition into the new Stone Age? Well, it occurred first in what we would now know as the Middle East. When people began to transition from nomadic hunter-gatherer culture into agrarian or farm culture. It's marked by the agricultural revolution, which we'll talk about more in depth here in a moment. And the popping up of the earliest villages and cities, which is where people begin to settle down and have, of course, early architecture as a result. And since life has become sedentary, an interesting thing that happens is that clay storage pots become prominent because one needs to start storing their stuff now that they're no longer nomadic. They need something to store that stuff in. So they need something to store that stuff in. So the spread of Neolithic agriculture, it was a technology, right? The agriculture, learning how to farm, how to domesticate animals, and to grow plants in such a way that they produce a much higher yield of food per the amount of land that they grow on. That was a technology that was developed in a few points of origin around the globe and then sort of spread outward from there. So you can sort of see all these different places where there's a big green blob, or in the case of this area in Africa where there's a green dotted line around this portion. It's because we know that the agricultural revolution in Africa started somewhere in here, but it's hard to sort of pin down exactly where. And the very first agricultural technology revolution began in the Middle East and then sort of spread outward from there. But there were also independent agricultural revolutions that happened in Asia, in Polynesia, this particular being in Indonesia here, and a few over in the Americas as well. Here's the interesting thing that your book points out that I had always learned was just the opposite. What I learned, and what I've actually been teaching in this class up until this book came along, by the way, is that the agricultural revolution comes along. People start learning how to cultivate plants and domesticate animals, and that is what then led to people being able to then stay put, and that those wandering tribes then began to build permanent settlements, and those became the first villages and cities. Your book, if you read the chapter, says that new discoveries have most historians agreeing now that it actually happened in just the opposite way. That the villages and the villages and settlements actually began to happen first. That people started congregating and saying, you know what? No, we're not constantly moving. We're going to live here. We're going to stay put. Was what then led toward the developments of agriculture, so that the villages and settlements came first, and the agricultural revolution was a way of meeting the needs of those villages and settlements. The complete opposite of what I learned and what I have been teaching up until this point. That's interesting, very interesting new thing that's been learned. And as I mentioned, because now people are remaining still, pottery becomes a big deal in the Neolithic era because you need storage for food and possessions. That becomes necessary now that, say, this is my home. Now that it's my home and I'm staying here, I need something to keep my stuff in. But also, this is my home. I want it to look good. So, not only do we end up with pottery at this time, but we start to have some really interesting artistic expressions that decorate that pottery. And one thing that is particularly notable in the Paleolithic period, particularly in the Middle East, is that the pottery, the decoration on the pottery, is this really interesting combination of naturalistic and abstract design. On this piece of earthenware, there are definitely things that are being represented. This right here, you may not notice right away, but this is meant to look like a dog, like a really stretched out, elongated dog. Like there's the tail. It's a repeated motif. A motif, that's a word you should write down, M-O-T-I-F. A motif is any element that gets repeated over and over again within a composition. And so the motif of that dog, and then up here, right, these look like just decorative lines, but when one really pays attention, you'll notice that these are birds with like really long necks. There's the body, there are the two legs. Here's the head with the beak up here. And then that's just repeated over and over and over again, that motif. And down here we have, using very geometric shapes, the representation of like a goat with like ram's horns that come way up here and swoop around. So there's this combination, because all that looks very abstract, but then even the animals themselves are treated as design elements and not just as naturalistic looking animals, right? The person who's made this dog, made this goat, and made these birds up here wasn't worried that they look exactly like the way their eyes saw those particular animals, right? It's a combination of naturalism and abstraction. And then what's particularly interesting to me and is indicative of the Neolithic period is that again, if you're storing stuff in these clay pots, it also helps if you label what's in it. And it looks like here that this little image with what appears to be sort of a stalk of wheat, or at least some sort of grain, is there to act as a label so that you know what's inside the pot. Pottery was such a big deal in the Paleolithic period that there's evidence from a lot of Neolithic grave sites that that suggest that people, either like what we see happening in the image to the left. This is a Neolithic grave site that was dug up. People were often buried with their pots. The pots seem to be very valuable possessions, and so people wanted to take them with them when they died. And there are also indications, as is the case with the image that we see on the right here, that the most highly regarded people and the people who were buried with the greatest riches, like this person here who has all of these rings that sort of seem to line his or her arms, there are indications that those people were the potters of their village, which is what people may believe may be why he or she was buried with all these pots right here above their head, right? Because again, you're the one who's providing a service that is suddenly, in the Neolithic period, indispensable. People need these pots to store their stuff, whereas they didn't in a century and millennia past. It also becomes important. This everybody knows Stonehenge. Everybody knows good old Stonehenge in England that was built. There are lots of different dates. The earliest sort of earthworks that we find in the area have been dated back to around about 3100 BCE. The actual stones that are erected in Stonehenge were not done that long ago. There are a million theories as to why Stonehenge was built. Whether or not it was some sort of a meeting place for religious ceremonies, all the way to like the History Channel's Ancient Aliens reasons for aliens that have come down and sort of plopped it here, right? All the same, one thing that we do know for sure is that on certain very important days of the year, like the summer solstice, the winter solstice, and things, and the summer equinox, the spring solstice, the winter solstice, and things of that nature, the sun rises. If you're standing in the center of this, the sun rises over very specific markers. So if nothing else, excuse me, Stonehenge is most definitely a calendar. Well, calendars are something that wouldn't have been all that necessary for most of human existence, right? But if you're suddenly very dependent upon knowing exactly when spring is going to begin, exactly when we're moving into fall, because you need to know when to plant your crops, and you need to know when to harvest so that you'll be prepared to get through the winter that's about to come, suddenly it becomes very important that you have a system for knowing when those things are occurring. So that becomes an innovation of the Neolithic era as well. All right, so that's going to be the end of part 1. We've been talking about prehistory here. In part 2, we'll dive into ancient history, the history of the first civilizations.